est ouverte.
Christine, is everything okay to get started?
Yes, Madam Chair, whenever you are ready.
Okay, thank you. All right. Welcome to our meeting this Friday. I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 23 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on International Trade. Today's meeting is webcast and is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of January 25th, 2021. And before I start, just a bit of committee business. I need approval from the committee for the budget for the study of COVID-19 in the amount of $2,625. If somebody could move approval of that.
I move it, Madam Chair, the approval of the budget.
Everybody's approval. And one other thing, we did receive a joint written brief from Professor Duprat and Parent on the WTO study that came in after the deadline. It was distributed to all of the members. Is it the will of the committee to accept that brief since we have not started consideration of the draft report? Is everyone in agreement to accept that brief even though that it came in slightly late? All right, I don't see any objections. Oh, good. Thank you, Mr. Abadai. Appreciate that. All right, pursuant to Standing Order 108 and the motion adopted by the committee on March 12th, 2021, the committee will proceed with its study of Canada's international trade and investment policy, selected considerations concerning COVID-19 vaccines. I'd like to introduce our witnesses today from England. As an individual, we have Simon Ebnett, Professor, University of St. Gallen. From the United States, on behalf of the Center for Global Development, Rachel Silberman, Policy Fellow, and Prasant Yadav, Senior Fellow. And from Canada, on behalf of Innovative Medicines Canada, Pamela Frelick, President, and Declan Hamil, Vice President, Legal, Regulatory Affairs and Compliance. And on behalf of Intellectual Property Institute of Canada, Nathaniel Lipkas, past board member, intellectual property lawyer, and patent agent. Professor Ebnett, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I hope you can hear me well. I will go through the points which were raised in the notice one by one. With respect to the TRIPS waiver, I'd like to make the following points. Speedy and equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines is imperative. The end is not in dispute, the means are. The key question is how to ramp up production quickly. The point of contention is whether waiving elements of the TRIPS agreement would help. I would urge members to distinguish between those who are advocating for real solutions to today's vaccine challenges versus those who are fighting yesterday's trade battles, especially with respect to intellectual property. Now, notwithstanding the letter which has apparently been sent by former government leaders to President Biden and mentioned in yesterday's Financial Times, and a campaign by certain NGOs, I have yet to read a single expert on vaccine production that says the compulsory licensing of intellectual property is the principal bottleneck to scaling up production of COVID-19 vaccines. I have read trade policy experts make such claims. I have not read any vaccine production experts make such claims. If one thinks about it, this is, I think, fairly clear why this is so. By now, it should be evident that even the firms that have developed the intellectual property in question have faced significant challenges scaling up production. Moreover, AstraZeneca's experience with contract manufacturing provides a shot across the bow to anyone who believes that solving this problem is merely a matter of transferring intellectual property. The production of vaccines is a sophisticated, complex process that requires well-trained talent and specialist facilities. It is quite likely that the real bottleneck is the availability of talent able to be able to manage these processes. I can understand the frustration of some listeners who would like to pass a law, introduce a new regulation, or suspend a trade agreement to fix this problem, but I fear that is not the right place to start. With respect to the CIIT agreement and making sure that Canada's advance purchases agreements will be respected, I do not see, in short, how CIIT helps in this regard. My remarks will focus principally not on the vaccine manufacturers, but on the governments where those manufacturers are located. Those governments can block exports through a variety of means, some of which are very subtle. Many of those subtle means have been documented by my colleagues and I over the past year. Few trade agreements contain provisions, let alone strong provisions, that curb the use of export controls. Agreements like CIIT certainly indicate a high level of goodwill and trust between the signatories, but whether that goodwill amounts to much in times of crisis is far from clear. Clearly, the lack of disciplines in trade agreements on export curbs is an oversight that should be fixed in years ahead. Let me turn then to the question of building domestic vaccine capacity. I'd like to make the following points. The first is American vaccine production is ramping up very quickly. And depending on the choices that the US makes concerning inoculation of children and the building up of vaccine return reserves in the second half of 2021, the US may well have very significant surpluses available. In this respect, myself and an expert in London circulated a note this morning with estimates of what the scale of those surpluses would be. What the Americans do with those surpluses is the key question. Already, the US has lent Canada AstraZeneca vaccines, and the White House has gone on record defending that action, saying that it is in the US's interests to ensure its neighbors have vaccines. In light of these considerations, I think there's both a short-term and a long-term answer to the question of building a vaccine capacity. In the short run, we have to remember that such investments are costly and will take time to implement. And what you may find is that by the time any new capacity is installed, you may find that there are already reserves of vaccines being shipped to Canada from the United States and elsewhere. The longer term answer to the question points to a precedent which is not particularly promising. Since 2012, Korea has built up its biopharmaceutical sector. It too vowed that it would never be short of vaccine production capacity. However, according to the press reports I've seen, the Korean government has spent over $2 trillion on this sector, and yet this has not delivered during this pandemic. Vaccination in Korea did not begin until the 26th of February 2021, and according to the World Health Organization, Korea has administered less than 1.9 million doses of vaccine by the 5th of April. That's just enough for 2.5% of its population. In other words, a decade-long effort of building production capacity in vaccines in Korea has not given that country a leg up in terms of COVID-19 inoculation. So what I take from the Korean example is that if one is thinking about engaging in industrial policy to build up vaccine production, one should learn from the Korean mistakes and understand why, despite spending over 2.2 billion Canadian dollars in public money, they were unable to have in place production facilities to be able to deliver COVID-19 vaccines when this crisis arose. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Professor Ebnett. On to Ms. Silverman, please.
Good afternoon, and my sincere thanks to the honorable members of this committee for the opportunity to testify today. In the context of appalling inequities in access to COVID-19 vaccines between wealthy countries and the global South, as this committee knows, South Africa and India have requested the World Trade Organization adopt a temporary waiver on intellectual property protections related to COVID-19 health technologies. I would like briefly to make a few comments in relation to the merits of this specific proposal before handing over to my colleague Prashant Yadav to discuss the intricacies of manufacturing scale-up. First, I think we would all agree that Canada has a moral imperative and self-interest in taking all possible actions to accelerate the timeline for global vaccine manufacturing, distribution, and administration. I understand that there has been frustration in Canada and many other wealthy countries about the pace of vaccination to this point. Nonetheless, that is now ramping up. But in large African countries like Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, and Angola, it is still the case that less than 1% of the population has been vaccinated. The most optimistic projections suggest that widespread vaccine coverage and herd immunity are roughly a year away in many of these countries. Others suggest a much longer timeline into 2023 and 2024. Ongoing circulation of the virus will also create ongoing opportunities for mutation, potentially creating new variants that evade existing vaccines and will threaten countries like Canada anew. Finally, the optics of Canada's return to normal life and full economic activity amid ongoing death and devastation across the global south would be a foreign policy disaster, driving justified anger and resentment. Canada must therefore examine the merits of this specific proposal vis-a-vis the goal of rapidly ending the global pandemic and mitigating these moral and practical risks. It is my view in this context, however, that the proposed waiver would have very limited impact in practical terms on efforts to scale up manufacturing and make COVID-19 vaccines available to poorer countries. This is not to say that patents never pose a problem. They do. To the contrary, for many drugs, including HIV drugs in the 1990s, patents have created an artificial monopoly that kept many in the global south from accessing life-saving health innovation. But it's important to understand that there is a key practical distinction between HIV drugs, for example, and COVID-19 vaccines. HIV drugs and most essential medicines are relatively simple chemical compounds that can be reverse engineered by a competent generic manufacturer. In these cases, it is patents and patents alone that would prevent a generic manufacturer from imitating and selling these products for affordable access in low and middle income countries. COVID-19 vaccines, in contrast, cannot be easily reverse engineered. Generic manufacturers require not just IP rights that could be waived under the TRIPS waiver, but also access to proprietary know-how, cell lines, manufacturing processes, and so forth to produce equivalent versions of approved vaccines. With or without a patent waiver, this is almost impossible to accomplish without the active assistance and cooperation of the originator pharmaceutical company. For these reasons, it is my view that adoption of the proposed waiver would have roughly zero net impact on the availability of COVID-19 vaccines in low and middle income countries. However, Canada's trade policy posture can still play a constructive role in increasing global access, and it must not signal apathy or indifference to poorer countries' need for affordable, timely vaccine access. G7 countries have used all policy levers at their disposal to increase the pharmaceutical industry's sense of urgency in meeting domestic vaccine demand in their respective countries via voluntary licensing deals, contracted manufacturing, and technology transfer. They should use the same toolbox plus leverage global advocacy to drive that same sense of urgency around prompt and affordable global access. Canada, along with its G7 allies, should leverage the TRIPS waiver campaign and use trade policy and leverage to further the pharmaceuticals industry's sense of urgency vis-a-vis this goal. As one specific measure, for example, Canada could unilaterally declare a policy of non-retaliation for any use of TRIPS flexibilities, existing TRIPS flexibilities, not adoption of this waiver, vis-a-vis COVID-19 health technologies. It could encourage its allies to follow suit via a broader G7 declaration. Thank you, and I yield to my colleague Prashant Yadav to further discuss the intricacies of manufacturing challenges.
Thank you, and thank you to members of this committee for giving me the opportunity to share my viewpoints on this very crucial topic. We acknowledge there is an urgent need to further scale up the production of safe, efficacious COVID vaccines, but also keeping in mind the need for versatility of the vaccine platform to deal with new COVID variants of concern and preparedness for any future pathogens. Preliminary estimates of capacity show us that in the aggregate, that is across all vaccine types, we may have sufficient manufacturing capacity to reach global herd immunity by Q1 or Q2 of next year. However, in the disaggregate, implying for specific vaccines such as the messenger RNA vaccines, the overall manufacturing capacity today is lower than the potential market demand. So this raises the question, how can we raise manufacturing capacity and expand it for specific platforms? Expanding manufacturing capacity to additional secondary manufacturing sites is a complex process which has 4 main prerequisites: new manufacturing equipment or significant upgrades to existing equipment in the new site, skilled and experienced chemistry, manufacturing, and control staff, quality management professionals at the receiving site, a strong regulatory agency in the country of the new site which can evaluate and approve the manufacturing process, and lastly, the open and free flow of international supply lines for vaccine ingredients and equipment, in particular, single-use equipment. All the companies which have received authorizations for their COVID-19 vaccines have already expanded manufacturing to a few additional sites. Given that medium and long-term demand for additional COVID-19 vaccine capacity remains uncertain, and as such, the long-term sustainability of new manufacturing sites remains unclear, the vaccine developers may not be willing to make additional capital investment and incur the additional operating costs for adding more manufacturing sites to their network. Public support in the form of capital subsidies or firm purchasing contracts can help resolve this medium to long-term demand uncertainty and can incentivize the companies to further expand manufacturing capacity in new locations. It will strengthen the business case for them to explore and evaluate not only vaccine manufacturing sites, but also contract manufacturing sites and sterile manufacturing sites, which could be added to their global manufacturing network. And in some cases, the efforts of individual companies could be further strengthened if publicly funded third parties can work to identify new sites that can meet the above mentioned criteria and do have some spare capacity. More importantly, the success of existing capacity expansion efforts and of any new manufacturing capacity expansion efforts depends on the free flow of vaccine ingredients and equipment. I'm sure you all have heard recent news about the shortages of single-use bioreactor bags and specialized filters, which could put manufacturing plants at risk of not being able to produce sufficient doses of vaccine. These would be manufacturing plants which already have the technology transfer, the manufacturing know-how, the intellectual property license, and all other prerequisites. So any restrictions on global supply chain flows create the risk of jeopardizing even our existing manufacturing capacity and delaying the start of new sites, which are currently getting ready for COVID-19 vaccine production. This is an extremely important area to address through the World Trade Organization and through other trade partnerships. In the medium to long term, we need to focus on 4 key areas to achieve higher production capacity. The first is invest in manufacturing sites which are flexible and can easily switch from one vaccine platform to another. Second, creating a larger pool of human capital that is specialized in biologics manufacturing. Third, further strengthening regulatory cooperation across countries. And fourth, preventing trade and policy barriers in the supply chain for vaccines and other critical health products. Thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts. I look forward to questions or any other ways I can help the work of this committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yadav. To the members of the committee, you can leave your cameras on, even though you've completed your testimony, so that you'll be available to participate in the question and answers. So please feel free to leave your cameras on. Okay, Ms. Fralek, President of Innovative Medicines Canada, please go ahead.
Thank you. Could I just check that you can hear me? We did have some tech problems getting connected.
Mm-hmm. No, you're very good right at this moment. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you. And bonjour à tous et à toutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. Honorable members, for this opportunity to address this motion to study Canada's trade and investment policies and the impact they're currently having on production and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines within our borders. These efforts, I'd like to note, have been remarkable for the degree of cooperation we are seeing across governments and our health systems during a time of unprecedented challenges. As someone who has worked in the health sector for most of her career, I would like to commend this government's unwavering focus and commitment to the health and safety of Canadians. Before I speak to the scope of your study, I would like to just provide you with some background information on Innovative Medicines Canada and how it informs our organization's perspective on aspects of the current motion. There are 47 companies that constitute our membership. Together, they support 100,000 high-value jobs. They contribute $15 billion annually to the Canadian economy and $2 billion in research and development. Though so much of the spotlight is currently on our sector's biomanufacturing capacity for vaccines, it's also important to remember that even now, there are more than 500 new products and medicines in development in Canada. This work includes the discovery and development of therapies for cancers, as well as rare and infectious diseases. Canadians can be proud of how our industry has taken up the fight against COVID-19 and the evolving challenges the variants of this virus present. The focus for our members from the very beginning has been on collaborating with each other, with governments, researchers, patients, to develop and deliver appropriate testing tools for diagnostics, medicines to treat those infected with the virus, and vaccines to stop its spread. This has been our industry's approach in Canada and across the sector's global ecosystem. One aspect of your study is in relation to a proposal to the World Trade Organization's trade-related aspects of Intellectual Property Rights Council, TRIPS, to essentially waive countries' core obligations under the TRIPS agreement to protect intellectual property for a broad range of technologies related to COVID-19 for the duration of the pandemic. Proponents of this initiative argue that revoking IP rights would lead to an increase in the supply of new vaccines in developing nations. However, there is no credible evidence validating this assumption, and we recommend that Canada stand with leading innovative jurisdictions to oppose this proposal. In the heat of the battle, like the one we're currently fighting against COVID, we do risk making decisions without substantively analyzing their anticipated efficacy and potential consequences. We must look at the nature of vaccines themselves, as other witnesses have already mentioned. They are complex biologics that require highly specialized manufacturing facilities. Some of the new vaccines have been created using advanced processes and technology which did not exist until a few years ago. As collaborative as the industry has been, we would not have been able to develop them without the support of a strong global innovation ecosystem rooted in competitive research and protected by globally agreed upon IP standards. Pfizer's vaccine, as an example, involves 280 components, 86 suppliers, and 19 countries. Sanofi and BioNTech's partnership will allow the latter to have access to the infrastructure and expertise to produce 125 million doses of the vaccine for Europe. Companies and governments have worked together around the world, identifying other manufacturers with the appropriate expertise, technical capabilities, and facilities, and entering into partnerships and agreements to speed up and scale up the production of vaccines. These are success stories based on the strong network for support and collaboration. While we are open and receptive to policy measures which would improve on current processes and timelines, they must be evidence-based. Some may argue that desperate times call for desperate measures, suggesting that eliminating IP rights is worth trying given the current issues with vaccination production and rollout in many nations. Let me be clear, this will simply not address the problem, but it will have negative consequences. Biological vaccine manufacturing capacity expansion requires expertise and know-how to be successful. Even if IP rights are no longer an issue, they cannot be efficiently and safely manufactured in a timely manner without the assistance and the collaboration with the original manufacturer. However, the proposed IP waiver would create potential impediments to current technology transfer partnerships, which may in turn negatively impact the response to the current pandemic. It's also important to look at the long-term effects of such proposals in detail. Weakening IP protections for vaccines will actually undermine the global response to the pandemic and for the pandemics we could face in the future. It will create confusion in the ecosystem, and that will inevitably delay research and innovation. It will also undermine the confidence in what is proven to be a functioning IP system, one that has allowed industry to confidently partner with academia, with research institutes, foundations, and other private companies. However, there are constructive improvements to our current processes that can be implemented. We can increase manufacturing capacity with technology transfer, voluntary licenses, and partnerships between companies. We can also identify and address regulatory inefficiencies while maintaining strict safety standards. We can eliminate export barriers to mitigate situations like what recently occurred in the EU, where vaccine shipments for other countries have been delayed or blocked. And Canadian officials should be commended for their swift action to strengthen international supply chains in the wake of this incident. This is indicative of our core strengths in advancing multilateral solutions and international regulatory harmonization. Biopharmaceutical companies are also working with international partners and NGOs to accelerate the delivery of COVID-19 vaccines. Our industry is working with the WHO's COVAX facility for global vaccine distribution, which began rolling out 2 billion vaccine doses for low and middle income countries in February of this year. Companies are also working with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Wellcome Trust, MasterCard on the COVID-19 Therapeutics Accelerator. Innovative life sciences companies are uniquely suited to collaborate in such partnerships and know which partners will be best to help maintain and increase supply. Canada's leadership role in the Ottawa Group, a group of 13 WTO members that was formed pre-COVID to ensure better coordination and cooperation among their countries, has been an important development. They have launched a trade and health initiative outlining concrete measures that can be taken by members to strengthen supply chains and facilitate the flow of essential medicines and medical supplies, including vaccines. They've also promoted the implementation of trade facilitating measures in customs and services, limiting export restrictions, temporarily removing or reducing tariffs on essential medical goods, and improving transparency overall. Diluting IP protections will also have the effect of deterring investment in our own country's life sciences sector. At a time when the pandemic has shown just how important the life sciences sector is to Canadians' health and well-being, we can ill afford supporting any measure that could drive out investment. IP is one of the key elements for Canada to take into consideration if it wants to grow its life sciences sector and improve its biomanufacturing capacity in a sustainable way. While further domestic IP improvements could be and should be undertaken, the Government of Canada made incremental life sciences IP improvements in the landmark Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the EU. We're also supportive of a new trade agreement with the UK that protects IP and promotes greater regulatory harmonization. This progress must be reinforced with more agile regulations, timely public access to innovation, skills and talent development, and other elements of a comprehensive life sciences strategy that we are eager to discuss with Canadian governments. Of course, we can do better. And to that end, all changes affecting the Canadian life sciences sector and the innovative pharmaceutical industry should be addressed by a whole of government approach in order to properly evaluate the impacts on the various other components of the sector. Indeed, we have made such recommendations through this government's biomanufacturing consultations. These recommendations include references to an urgent need to suspend the July 21 implementation of damaging changes to the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, or PMPRB, at least until the COVID-19 pandemic has abated. The PMPRB changes are having a destabilizing impact on our industry at a highly sensitive time. They are strongly opposed not only by industry, but by patient groups and life sciences stakeholders due to concerns about impacts on access to new innovative medicines and Canada's future domestic life sciences capacity. We maintain it is the innovative research companies who have proven uniquely qualified to create and sustain the partnerships to maintain and increase supply. Canada's trade and regulatory policies can and should be used to improve conditions for investment, ensure the acceleration of approvals, advance the most effective solutions to address supply chain bottlenecks, and strengthen our health systems around the world to get vaccines to citizens as quickly as possible. We continue to welcome an enhanced dialogue and partnership with the federal government in these efforts. Thank you for the time you've provided me to speak to you today, and we would be happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Frelick. On to Nathaniel Lipkis, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair and honorable members of the committee. I represent the Intellectual Property Institute of Canada, or IPIC, as a past board member and a past chair of its International Trade Policy Committee. IPIC, for those who don't know, is the professional association of patent agents, trademark agents, and lawyers practicing in all areas of intellectual property law. Our membership totals over 1,800 individuals in Canada, consisting of practitioners in law firms and agencies of all sizes, sole practitioners, in-house corporate IP professionals, government personnel, and academics. And our members' clients include virtually all Canadian businesses, universities, and other institutions that have an interest in IP in Canada or elsewhere, as well as foreign companies that hold IP rights in Canada. My comments today will focus on Canada's position with respect to the WTO TRIPS waiver. The purpose of the waiver is to remove IP barriers that prevent WTO members from manufacturing and accessing COVID-19 medical products. Our primary goal is to get as many vaccine doses in the arms of the world's 7.8 billion people as possible. My organization, IPIC, is not here to take a position on whether a TRIPS waiver or any other IP solution will enhance vaccine access. Rather, we're here to provide necessary information about the IP rights framework and Canada's role within it. Our hope is to assist this committee to make recommendations that appropriately balance effective IP protection with the imperative of access to essential medical products. I'll make 3 principal points. Number 1, the TRIPS waiver is not about enhancing domestic biomanufacturing or Canadian vaccine access. It's about empowering less developed countries. Number 2, TRIPS was designed to provide certain flexibilities to address national health emergencies. The sensibility of a waiver or any TRIPS-based solution depends on what needs are unaddressed by those flexibilities. And 3, Canada's experience shows that the effectiveness of a TRIPS solution requires careful consideration and implementation. My first point is that this committee should not view the proposed TRIPS waiver as being about enhancing Canadian manufacturing or access to COVID-19 vaccines. Removing TRIPS obligations would empower TRIPS members to suspend patent and other IP rights without violating TRIPS. For some countries, such as South Africa or India, provided other important barriers already mentioned are removed, this waiver may clear a path to enhanced COVID-19 vaccine access domestically and for export. Not so for Canada. Canada's most significant trade agreements over the last 30 years have included IP commitments over and above TRIPS. If TRIPS obligations were suspended, Canada would continue to be subject to such commitments in the Canada-US-Mexico agreement that replaced NAFTA, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and CITA. These additional barriers mean that Canada would need to negotiate with the US and Mexico, the EU, and the TPP member countries in order to give domestic effect to a TRIPS waiver in those agreements in Canada. And after that, domestic amendments would be required to suspend domestic IP provisions to facilitate any extraordinary measure facilitated by the TRIPS waiver. It is unlikely that all this would be accomplished, if at all, in a time frame that would be meaningful for enabling Canadian vaccine access. Canada benefits from near and medium-term vaccine commitments, and it is unlikely to be capable of large-scale biomanufacturing for export anytime soon. My second point is that the sensibility of a waiver or any TRIPS-based solution depends on what needs are unaddressed by the current TRIPS flexibilities for addressing public health. COVID-19 is not the first international health crisis that has led to rethinking of international IP rules. In fact, the international consensus on IP rules embodied in TRIPS was forged in the fire of the AIDS crisis. The TRIPS agreement, signed in 1994, harmonized a minimum standard of 20 years of patent protection for pharmaceutical inventions. But the agreement also created certain flexibilities. Article 8 of TRIPS authorizes members to adopt measures necessary to protect public health and nutrition, provided that such measures are consistent with TRIPS. Article 31 of TRIPS enables a government or third party authorized by government to use the subject matter of a patent without the authorization of the patent holder. This authorization is called a compulsory license. The scope and duration of a compulsory license must be limited to the purpose for which it was authorized, non-exclusive, non-assignable, and predominantly for domestic supply. Prior to granting a license, effort to obtain authorization from the rights holder on reasonable commercial terms must be made and have been unsuccessful. However, there's no need to seek a voluntary license in the case of a national emergency or other circumstances of extreme urgency or in cases of public non-commercial use. And lastly, Article 6 of TRIPS provides for parallel importation of patented medicines. Parallel importation allows countries to obtain patented products from other countries without the authorization of the patent holder. This can be legally permissible in countries applying the legal doctrine of exhaustion of rights. These 3 flexibilities, measures to protect public health, domestic compulsory licenses, and parallel imports, were the only TRIPS flexibilities available until it became clear that they were inadequate to address HIV/AIDS. Countries requiring AIDS medicines did not have the domestic capacity to manufacture the drugs they needed. So, in 2003, countries with manufacturing capacity were empowered under TRIPS to export patented products to eligible importing countries having insufficient or no pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity. Compulsory licenses for export could be issued for amounts necessary to meet the identified needs of an importing country, with imported medicines clearly identified as produced under this system and with the importing country required to take reasonable measures to prevent re-exportation of products. The wisdom of a TRIPS waiver must be assessed against the backdrop of these flexibilities I've just described, taking into account today's barriers, not the HIV ones, but the ones that confront manufacturing and access of COVID-19 medical products in light of our collective experience under the current TRIPS framework. And this brings me to my third point, which is that Canada's experience shows that the effectiveness of a TRIPS solution requires careful consideration and implementation. Canada was the first country to attempt to implement compulsory licenses for export to enable access to AIDS medicines after AIDS killed 3 million people in 2003 alone. The Jean Chrétien Pledge to Africa Act would have empowered Canadian generic drug manufacturers to manufacture and export medicines to least developed countries being ravaged by AIDS. The political and the corporate will was there in spades, but the implementation was unsuccessful. Only 2 drug shipments were ever exported. The restrictions were considered by manufacturers to be impractical because new operations were needed just to enable the licenses, which themselves were valid for only 2 years and only eligible for 1 renewal. There is no other success story to speak of anywhere in the world. Contemporaneously, brand name manufacturers of AIDS medicines began to issue voluntary licenses to generic manufacturers to supply AIDS drugs to the developing world. This campaign started slowly around 2006, but many millions of generic AIDS medicines were being exported at pennies on the dollar within a few years. This approach was replicated for hepatitis C drugs in the mid-2010s. So although domestic compulsory licenses have continued to play a meaningful role in enabling domestic access to essential medicines, brand name manufacturers have developed their own global access solutions that have played a significant role as well. It's 2021, and the cauldron of access to medicines policy solutions continues to stir as we confront COVID-19. We've learned what we can and can't do with TRIPS. We've learned what brand name companies have been able to do to support global access. A good decision regarding the TRIPS waiver will be based on an identification of the true barriers to access and the successful targeting of those barriers, taking into account extraordinary global health efforts over decades across the stakeholder spectrum. To determine if a TRIPS solution is warranted, TRIPS member countries should identify what COVID-19 vaccine access will be enabled by the solution over and above what's already enabled by existing TRIPS flexibilities, and members should cooperate to facilitate and remove barriers to that increased access, whether they be imposed by TRIPS or otherwise. If, on the other hand, a TRIPS solution is unlikely to enable meaningfully faster or broader vaccine access, or there are other more effective solutions, then TRIPS members should come together to support other solutions that will facilitate that access. And Canada should not place the burden of proof on proponents or on detractors of the TRIPS rate waiver, but rather undertake its own critical assessment and support what it thinks will work best. The common goals are shots in arms and saving lives, and we at IPIC applaud the committee for taking seriously any initiative that will help achieve these goals in Canada and around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lipkiss. On to our members, starting with Ms. Gray, please, for 6 minutes.
Great, thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank all of the witnesses for being here today. My first questions are for Ms. Freilich at Innovative Medicines, and I appreciate your comments today on intellectual property when it comes to innovation in biomanufacturing. And we know how important it is to get COVID-19 vaccines to developing countries. If it's not intellectual property slowing down vaccines being accessed to these developed countries, what would you say would be the issues then?
Thank you, and Madam Chair, through you. I think the answer to that question is complex and has multiple possible answers to it, from supply chains to the fact that it is a revolutionary technology that we, as we mentioned, I mentioned in my comments, the the technology we're using for most of the current vaccines didn't even exist a few years ago, et cetera. I will, by the way, call on my colleague, Mr. Hamill, to jump in because his expertise is in the IP side of things as well. But again, just my quick response to you would be that there are multiple reasons for it. And this is why we are really pushing to make sure that we don't move too quickly to any one solution that seems nice and shiny on the outside, but really will not have the intended effect in terms of the goals of this particular committee. Declan, did you want to, on our behalf, add any comments?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the committee for allowing IMC to speak to you today. I would just add briefly, and this was already touched upon by some of the other witnesses to the committee, the issue of regulatory barriers and the issue of impediments to international supply chains is right now a clear and present danger. Canada has directly experienced this in the context of the European Union and some of the measures that the European Union has undertaken. Fortunately, and partially because of the great work of officials at Global Affairs Canada, there hasn't been a significant issue for Canada, but there have been issues for other nations. So impediments to global supply chains are certainly a very significant issue, and regulatory cooperation in terms of recognition of vaccines is also a very important issue that needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And you actually answered what one of my second questions was going to be. So, so thank you for that. Your organization has raised publicly that the relationship between the present federal government and your industry is not the most friendly. And so, would you say that this type of broken relationship has an impact on Canada's rapid access to securing vaccine doses?
I do believe that there is a relationship through Madam Chair. Without pointing fingers at any particular government, for decades now, it has been what I've used the word, it's not been an ideal relationship. The life sciences sector writ large, the pharmaceutical industry is one part of that, has not been viewed as the contributor to the health and the economy of the country that we feel it should be. And so despite multiple attempts on the part of the industry from our global CEOs, this is a global industry, pre-pandemic, the global leaders were concerned about some of the measures being taken by the current government, have reached out to have conversations to try to find that more balanced approach that we're seeking. We understand there are sustainability issues for the cost of drugs, but there's a huge value to the economy as well. And so our global CEOs have reached out to meet with Mr. Trudeau, Ms. Freeland, and others on at least 4 occasions over the last 3 years, but have not been successful in that regard. So when you don't have that relation, I should add, by the way, the Canadian CEOs also have worked very hard over the last few years to engage with the government to have that more productive conversation about how we can work together, but with I was going to say limited success, but probably no success is more legitimate. So yes, that when you don't have a relationship with the industry, it is difficult to achieve some of your other options. The industry does not see Canada as an attractive country in many ways, from regulatory and access and IP data protection perspectives, to come and invest in the country. And so while the government did do a good job of procuring through contractual agreements a lot of vaccines, actually getting it into the country, being at the top of the list simply has not been happening.
Great, thank you for that. That's really shocking, actually, to hear that you're reaching out to the Prime Minister and to other leadership, and they're not returning your call. I'm sure that'll be pretty shocking for people to hear, considering what's going on. I wanted to ask, last week Canada received our first shipment from COVAX, about 300,000 doses, and we know that we're the only G7 country to be accepting vaccines from the program at this point, with current vaccine procured through the program going mostly to developed or developing countries. Would you say that Canada not rating vaccines meant for low and middle income countries would be important to get vaccines to those countries right now that need it?
I think that there is a global ethical and moral obligation to make sure that everyone in this world does have access to vaccines. Absolutely. In terms of the COVAX facility, it was very clearly set up to do that, but also to be of assistance to countries that were contributing the vaccines. So I'm not the expert on the COVAX facility, although we're very aware of it, obviously, and in fact, I would go further to say COVAX being one pillar under the accelerating access to COVID-related tools initiative. Our international body is a co-founder of that initiative, so very, very supportive. But I'm not the expert on it. However, I do know that it was set up to allow for both actions to take place. So beyond that, I really can't.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Frederick. Ms. Gray, on to Mr. Dhaliwal, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I would like to thank all the presenters here, but my question will go to Mr. Lipkas of IPEC. As indicated, that concentrating on the TIPS waiver as a magic bullet for vaccine access and production will not work. First, am I right in saying that the TIPS member countries must be pragmatic and realistic and agree on what are truly effective solutions first, based on, as you said, flexibilities? Secondly, it seems that we need to seek an agreement with other member countries on these broader considerations first. Am I right saying that this would be your recommendation?
Well, I mean, I started my comments by saying that we were not going to recommend a solution, and I'm certain that if I were to canvass the membership of IPIC, there would be a diversity of views. But what I can say is that a pragmatic solution is needed. We're trying to get vaccines to as many people as possible, and talking about intellectual property rules is just one means for consideration. It may be a tool that's useful. It may be that a TRIPS waiver is an option. It may be that there's something short of that makes sense, depending on whether other capacity can be marshaled. We heard from Mr. Yadav about 4 barriers: manufacturing equipment, skilled workers, regulatory agencies, and free flow of supply lines. And so if there is a solution that somebody puts forward where a TRIPS waiver will couple with those and lead to better outcomes than any other solution that's on the table, then we shouldn't ignore it. At the same time, there are a lot of good people trying to do good things, and we need to make sure we look at everything. And this is one where, in some might say it's the more the merrier, but others might say it's too many cooks in the kitchen, and some smart people need to figure out which one we're dealing with here.
We all know, I mean, it took significant innovation to develop the COVID vaccines around the globe. And how would the uncertainty created by a potential TIPS waiver damage innovation in life sciences and biotech industries?
Is that the question posed to me?
Yes, please.
It's hard for me to answer on behalf of an industry. I note that you have the representatives of the industry sitting here, and they can provide a view.
I would love them to go ahead.
I'll let them explain what they perceive as the impact to their industry.
Declan, this probably is a good one for you to take on.
Yeah, certainly, and thanks for the question. The industry has established in record-breaking time a network of voluntary licensing agreements with other parties, and it's interesting that the IP always seems to be the focus of these issues. The CEO of the Serum Institute, which is a huge Indian-based producer of vaccine, basically licensing currently the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, but they plan on producing other vaccines as well. He was asked straight out, is there a problem in terms of collaboration and voluntary licensing with originator entities? And he said, no, that's not the problem. said the problem is it takes time to ramp up facilities. The scale of facilities needed to deal with COVID vastly eclipses the existing capacity in the world. And so, there's an exponential ramp up needed by existing vaccine makers, and they're doing it as quickly as they can. But nevertheless, it does take time and effort. His focus, and this is actually on the public record, I think it was in The Guardian, he said the issue is my problems with the US FDA and with the European Medicines Agency in terms of rapid approval of medicines. So I think when we look and consider TRIPS, when we consider existing flexibilities, we have to ask ourselves, like, what problem are we trying to solve? And if voluntary licensing agreements and other forms of tech transfer partnerships between innovative companies and entities like the Serum Institute are working, granted, everyone would like them to work faster than they do now. Everybody would like more production. We have to ask ourselves, is a TRIPS waiver going to contribute to that? And the answer from the innovative industry would be no. If anything, it would be disruptive to existing arrangements, which, while everyone would like these things to move faster, are actually yielding real world benefits in terms of vaccine production. I hope I've addressed your question.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Dollar. I'm sorry your time is up. Thank you, Mr. Hamel. Yes, on to Mr. Savard Tremblay for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and hello to all of the witnesses. Thank you for the presentations and the time that you've spent on this study. I'd like to ask a question of Ms. Silverman. You mentioned the idea that we've heard that vaccine patents should be temporarily lifted. I understand the idea. I'm even sympathetic to it in certain respects. However, it seems to me that less would be changed by doing so than we believe. The issue seems to be that there's a lack of manufacturing facilities, human resources, etc. How could we lift the patents and then make up for these shortcomings in other areas?
Thank you very much for the question. So I do agree with you. The patents are not the primary barrier, which is why I do not think the TRIPS waiver will be particularly effective. However, that's not to say that IP, broadly speaking, is not an issue at all. So I would distinguish between two things. So one is the legal right to produce a product, which is what sort of the patent would cover. Roughly speaking, there's some intricacies here, but the legal right to produce a product. And then the other is the knowledge, the know-how, the trade secrets, the proprietary info required to actually do so. So there's a process called technology transfer, whereby an originator company can impart this knowledge to a generic manufacturing firm. And there are still generic manufacturing firms that are saying they have capacity to produce and are not doing so, and that they have not received technology transfer or that information from the originators. Now, the specifics of any individual case are a little bit hard to parse. It's hard to parse the economics of whether this is actually viable to do and scale up, whether they actually have the necessary capabilities, and it's a case-by-case basis. However, I think what we would like to see is a bit more pressure being placed on pharmaceutical companies, and they're already doing so. So I'm not trying to say none of this is happening. It is, but to speed the process by which they are evaluating tech transfer and voluntary licensing opportunities and making use of the capacity that does exist. Now, none of this is a magic bullet, but I think that to the extent we can speed and motivate rapid evaluation, discovery of such capacity, and help facilitate voluntary licensing deals, which, by the way, would protect IP within the bounds of that licensing deal. This is not about freeing IP for everyone, but it's about a voluntary process of technology and technology transfer and sharing.
Merci pour cette réponse. Donc,
Thank you. I understand then and please tell me if I'm mistaken in what I've understood. If I summarize, there are facilities, manufacturing facilities that would like to have this technology but are not able to receive it. So it's not that there are necessarily a shortage of facilities. Could you talk about the lack of human resources as well? That's something else that's been noticed.
I might turn it over to my colleague Prashant Yadav, who would be more knowledgeable on this point.
Thank you. So I think it's fair to say that there are many facilities globally, some of which, and I'm underscoring the word some of which, may be having the required equipment to start manufacturing COVID vaccines of different types. But equipment is only one part of a multi-dimensional need for a facility to start manufacturing. Like I emphasized earlier, having trained chemistry, manufacturing, and controls specialists and having trained and
Mr. Yadav, the clerk here, could you raise your mic a bit? It would help the interpreters, please.
I'm sorry about that. Yeah, so having trained chemistry, manufacturing, and control staff and having quality management specialists is an important prerequisite. Even when we have facilities around the world which have the equipment to manufacture COVID vaccines, they do not necessarily have the human resources that are required. Now, one way to think about it is that we can supplement their human resources by the company which has the originator product helping them out. But again, those are the things that require both larger public investment and also time and resourcing from the side of the innovative company.
Je vous remercie pour cette réponse, Monsieur Yadav.
Thank you very much for your answer, Mr. Yadav. What do you think of the COVAX initiative, which would provide doses for at least 20% of the population? We know that Canada is investing heavily in this facility, that for every dose received, it will provide an equivalent number internationally, including AstraZeneca vaccines by the end of June. Is this a good initiative? Is it sufficient? Or is it a poor initiative? I just want to know what you think.
So my viewpoint is it's a very good initiative. It allows a large number of countries who either do not have the financing, the working capital, the size of the market, or the ability to negotiate vaccine access for themselves. It does it collectively for them. In addition to this, it also provides them a pooled indemnity insurance. So many aspects are addressed by pooling the needs of multiple countries. The challenges have been, how do we guarantee enough supply to the COVAX facility so that it can deliver on its promise of providing at least 20% to all of the countries? In reality, we would want to ask the question, why only 20%? Perhaps this should be a structure we use for providing 40% or a higher percentage of coverage for each country. But the current constraints have been the supply coming into COVAX.
Thank you, Mr. Yadav. Okay, on to Mr. Blakey, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. I mean, we've certainly heard today that, and I think, members probably reasonably expected going in today, that there are a number of factors beyond simple access to intellectual property that go into the manufacture of a vaccine, but certainly intellectual property is one of those factors. And even in the case of negotiating a voluntary licensing agreement, presumably that takes a fair bit of time and resources. And so we now have countries that have come to the WTO asking for not a blanket exemption to the entire intellectual property infrastructure, but a temporary waiver for a very specific purpose, which is to make the recipes for COVID-19 vaccines able to be used by as wide a cross-section of those in the vaccine manufacturer industry as possible, for a recipe that has benefited and whose development has been made possible not by the typical process where you have a lot of private investment and risk taken, but by a considerable amount of public investment by governments the world over, not just in Canada, but the world over. And so it does seem to me that taking one of those complicated elements off of the table would help facilitate a speedier expansion of global supply. That's not to say that it helps overcome all of the obstacles, but it helps overcome one of the obstacles. And I haven't heard anybody here today say that, you know, intellectual property rights present no obstacles at all to the expansion of global vaccine supply, just that it's only one among many. But it seems to me if our goal is to try and increase that supply, that taking as many obstacles off the table as possible is a prudent approach. And so, you know, in terms of, you know, direct questions, I think, you know, one of the things that I also haven't heard, because I have heard that, you know, that this waiver is not a panacea, and fair enough. In fairness, I don't know that anyone is really suggesting that it is. It's just a step in the right direction. I don't see that the waiver would do harm in the sense of relaxing some of the typical intellectual property restrictions for a very targeted purpose and for a temporary time frame. So I don't know if we have a witness that wants to speak to that issue, but it seems to me that taking this off the table would be helpful. It would give facilities where they believe they have capacity the opportunity to explore that with less restrictions in their way. I see Ms. Fralick has her hand up, so I'll give her the opportunity to respond.
And thank you so much for raising that issue, and it's such a good discussion point. I will turn to my colleague, Mr. Hamill, in a moment, but wanted to make, I guess, one quick comment. We actually do believe there could be harm, and I mentioned this in my comments, but we'd be pleased to go into that in a little bit more detail. But the other piece I wanted to raise is, and you may have information that we don't have, by the way, there's so much going on in the world these days, it's hard to keep up, but we simply have not seen any evidence that, that any of the COVID-19 vaccine developers, when asked for, that they've refused to license their IP. So the system does seem to be working, as far as we can tell. And of course, the other piece that we've, I think all the witnesses have made reference to, is that it's not quite as simple as just having, someone referred to it today as the recipe, but the IP information, and then can suddenly produce a vaccine. And so there's a practicality behind this that we feel is quite a significant barrier. But in terms of the harm piece and the undermining of the process that is working well, we feel, I'll perhaps turn to Declan just to answer your question a little bit more thoroughly.
I do have a quick question just in follow-up to that comment, because it's something that we've heard a lot today already, that there are other pieces in order to be able to effectively manufacture vaccines, and that's quite a reasonable claim, as I say. I mean, I think many people are not surprised to hear that. My question is, we have the governments of India, South Africa, and others coming to the table, pursuing an initiative that takes time and resources for them in order to try and mobilize a global campaign of governments to sign on to this waiver, to take this issue up repeatedly at the World Trade Organization. Surely it can't be your position that it will be news to them to find out, once they have broader access to the intellectual property involved, that there are other dimensions to manufacturing a vaccine. I mean, I find it very hard to believe that they've put the effort into organizing behind this waiver in ignorance of the fact that there are a number of factors that go into the manufacture of a vaccine, and it'll be a surprise to them when they get the IP that the people they've been working with domestically aren't able to produce the vaccine. So I mean, I do find it insufficient for me to hear of these other factors. As I say, I think reasonable people would expect that there are many things that go into this kind of complex manufacturing process. But the idea that somehow the proponents of the waiver would be ignorant of that, and that they don't have promising leads within their own country where intellectual property is either the primary or a significant barrier to increasing their production strikes me as very, very hard to believe. I see we have another witness with their hand up, and he just moved on his screen. So I might be Ms. Silverman and her colleague from the Institute. Perhaps you'd like to weigh in on that question.
I'm sorry, Mr. Blakey, your time is up. But if I could possibly get a brief answer, maybe from Ms. Silverman, please.
So just one point briefly on that. I mean, I think our colleague from the IP Association referenced this briefly. A lot of the history of some of these access to medicine sites is around threats to IP, around compulsory licensing and other measures that then extract concessions around voluntary licensing and other more voluntary measures. So I think that's one potential explanation. If you increase the pressure on industry and you make it clear that you are willing to take more dramatic actions, that is going to create some amount of momentum around voluntary action on behalf of the pharmaceutical industry.
Right. Thank you very much, Ms. Silverman. On to Mr. Abatai for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to the witnesses. A great presentation this morning. I have an article dated November 13, 2020 from Reuters, and I quote, Canada's reliance on supply contracts to secure COVID-19 vaccines from drug makers like Pfizer Inc. has put the life of Canadians and prospect for the economy over the next year in the hands of few foreign companies facing overwhelming global demand. The article adds that, quote, as other governments put hundreds of millions or billions into vaccine development, Canada has earmarked $1 billion Canadian, 761 million US to buy vaccine doses abroad. The question is, to what extent do you think this article is accurate? And question number two, what have we done wrong in Canada in racing with the time to be able to provide Canadian better results at such difficult time? So I will start with Ms. Fralick, and then maybe I'll move to Mr. Everend after that. So Ms. Fralick, please.
Thank you. And I will invite my colleague to jump in on this one, but because I would be repeating a few things that I said earlier, I do believe that there's a history of a less than ideal relationship between this industry and governments, which has led to a very unattractive business environment for the industry to be present here in Canada. And that has lessened our domestic capacity, which I think is what you're referring to primarily in the article. But there are a couple of aspects that I'm quite sure Mr. Hama would like to comment on, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, so I'd start by saying that, you know, there are, and Professor Evan had pointed this out as well, sometimes having a robust pharmaceutical industry doesn't necessarily insulate you from the difficulties that can occur as a result of a global pandemic. Clearly, it's helpful. It's helpful for your public health policy. It's also helpful for your economy. But that said, you know, these things are extremely difficult to predict, and you know, they're very difficult to manage in practice. However, in terms of getting more infrastructure into the country, and here I'll express a little bit of frustration because, you know, there is a room somewhere at the Ministry of Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, which is filled with reports about life sciences innovation over the years. Most recently, we had one which was put out by the Health and Biosciences Economic Strategy Table, HBEST, in late 18. And it was a group of industry, academia, and also government officials. Deputy Minister of Health, Deputy Minister of ICE had participated. They put out a report on how to build a life sciences sector in greater capacity in Canada. And it related to not just IP, it talked about regulatory barriers and taxation and labor skills, etc. And it was a great report. And since the report came out, not much has happened. We have a history in Canada of thinking very long and hard about life sciences innovation, but we don't really do very much. We don't implement our great thoughts. So a good starting point would be to go back to HBEST and to revisit that and to try and implement some of its recommendations. That in and of itself will not, you know, necessarily, as Professor Evan had pointed out, yield direct benefits in terms of a pandemic vaccine, but it would create more infrastructure and capacity within the country in the medium to long term.
Well, to be ready to face pandemic or any other term as such or challenge, just not the vaccination only. The other, I mean, rapid testing, for example. I mean, to be able to provide rapid testing to keep the economy going, to keep, I mean, to add some security and certainty to what we do on a daily basis was not even there. So if the vaccine need some kind of special licensing, an IP license to be passed to certain countries, I don't know where we fail. Like, don't you agree that there's a big failure in dealing with this whole thing? And by the way, as a matter of time, we had we knew about the pandemic coming our way months before it hits our border. What do you think of that? If I may ask again, Ms. Freilich, to comment on this as well as Mr. Hamill.
Okay, I'm sorry, but your time is up, so it's going to have to be a brief answer from Ms. Freilich as well as Mr. Ebnet, I think you referred to.
I think there are a great number of things that we could have done differently, and we'll be happy to have that conversation with you perhaps offline to share some extra thoughts.
Thank you.
My brief observation is that I think the cost-benefit analysis of investments in vaccine production and development were not correct. We have, as you noted, a $1 billion investment by the Canadian government. The losses to the Canadian economy are orders of magnitude larger. And you have to wonder if more money had been spent and invested along the entire vaccine supply chain, whether the result would have been different. In this regard, the British experience, where they spent over £10 billion doing this, I think gives you some sense of the type of money involved. And of course, I would argue that the British experience showed that there was a very close partnership between industry and government, and that does not appear to be the case in Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Ebnet. On to Ms. Bindayan, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of the witnesses for this very interesting discussion. Mr. Lipkiss, in his opening remarks, identified 3 articles of the TRIPS agreement, Article 8, 31, and 6, I believe, which reflect current flexibilities in the TRIPS agreement. I was wondering, Ms. Silverman, if you agreed with Mr. Lipkiss's reference to those articles, and if those were the flexibilities that you yourself were referring to earlier.
So I would defer to him on the numbering of the flexibilities and such, but yes, generally speaking, those are the flexibilities to which I was referring.
Okay, and Ms. Silverman, is it your opinion that those flexibilities are not only useful but sufficient at this point in time of the pandemic?
So the challenge with TRIPS flexibilities is not just in the letter of the law, what is technically written into it, but in the actual applicability of those flexibilities. So as Mr. Lipkiss mentioned, many countries are also bound by bilateral trade deals with the US or Europe or the UK or Canada or others. And then there are sort of extra trade deal pressures that are often brought to bear against countries that try and exercise TRIPS flexibilities. So even though these are legal under the TRIPS framework, that does not mean there is no consequence for trying to exercise them. So it is my opinion that if these flexibilities could be exercised without retaliation or threat thereof, or without constraint within other bilateral trade deals, they would be sufficient. But as it is, they are problematic.
I see. But we also heard in earlier testimony that there hasn't been, at least to date, any issue in terms of granting these compulsory licenses, or at least so far in exercising these flexibilities. Is that your understanding of the current situation?
So it is my understanding that there have been no compulsory licenses issued for COVID vaccines thus far. Now, it's hard to know to what extent that is because there is no opportunity for a compulsory license to be issued, where it would be useful, versus countries are doing a cost-benefit analysis of, okay, maybe there would be some upside to this, but we expect trade retaliation from many other countries, so we would not want to do it. I suspect it's certainly part of both. Probably the retaliation makes them hesitant to even consider it. And on the other hand, there's probably no golden opportunity where the upside would justify doing so. So I think it's a little bit of both, but the retaliation certainly plays a role.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Fallick, I believe you were interrupted earlier in your conversation with another colleague. You had wanted to identify, along with your colleague, Mr. Hamill, some of the risks that we would be opening ourselves up to should we move forward with the TRIPS waiver. I don't know if Mr. Hamill, you wanted to expand.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you bringing that back before the committee. And Ms. Freilich may also want to add into this, but I would say, first of all,
I do, and I can't get up. I don't want to.
So in any case, I would say, first of all, I take issue with a statement made with respect to the financing with respect to the vaccine production. It's not the case that this has all somehow been underwritten by governments. Governments have funded and have provided significant support. It depends on the vaccine manufacturer, but it's not the case, as is portrayed by some, that this is some sort of issue where sort of colloquially the industry has kind of already been paid and therefore there's nothing to recoup anymore. That's simply untrue. There have been huge investments made, and in many cases, there hasn't been success. I mean, huge multinational entities with vaccine expertise like Merck, GSK, and Sanofi had tried, and ultimately they have not been successful so far with respect to COVID-19 vaccines. So there's a lot of costs that are assumed by these manufacturers.
And sorry to interrupt, Mr. Hamill, but does that put us at risk, perhaps, for future pandemics in terms of having these players in the market?
Yeah, precisely, because they are making significant investments. They make these investments based on a playing field which they believe they understand, and intellectual property is part of that. So, in terms of their business planning, in terms of how they're going to map out expansions in productions, training skilled personnel, etc., developing resources, working with partners in other jurisdictions, they have to understand the lay of the land. And if you have a situation where the rules might change because somebody decides that this is a situation where the rules must change, that will clearly be disruptive. So, the idea that there's no consequence is, I think, that's simply not the case.
Thank you very much. On to Monsieur Savard Tremblay for 2.5 minutes, please.
Oui, merci. Alors,
Thank you. My question is for Mr. Hamill and Ms. Freilich, rather. As of 2003, the SARS report by Miller very seriously criticized Canada's national capacity. It suggested that we make major investments to boost our capacity, research in particular, with working with universities. Gary Covinger, a doctor, a microbiologist from Quebec, said in 2020, or rather communicated with the government in 2020, to strike partnerships, as has been done in Great Britain. So from the very beginning, Canada could have forged partnerships to be able to produce vaccines nationally. We talked then about the lack of communication with the Prime Minister. Could I hear you on that, please?
Thank you for the question. Merci beaucoup. I will respond in French, or in English, I should say, just to keep it straight.
Sentez-vous très à l'aise.
You've captured the situation well, I think, and if I could raise it one level, in general, governments of all stripes, all countries do not put the emphasis on prevention and early warning signals, if you will, early warning systems. And so I think, speaking specifically to Canada, we have not done a good job of using the knowledge that we have, whether it's from SARS or H1N1, Looking at some of the work, maybe outside Canada, but Bill Gates was predicting a pandemic in 2015, I believe. And so there were many, many signals that many countries, including Canada, should have looked at and been better prepared. In Canada itself, I've said this before, and I say this, I'll say it with a note of optimism, because you have an industry represented here by myself and my colleague, ready to engage with government to have these tough conversations. We appreciate that it's industry, it's always a bit of tension there, but we do believe that there's a much better solution for Canadians when industry and government are talking regularly with one another. That has not been the case. And so I do believe that has been a factor in all of the decisions that have been made along the way. Again, we have global leaders who are used to meeting with Boris Johnson, deference to our colleague here from the UK, with Emmanuel Macron, with President Biden, Suga, etc. They are confounded as to why they've not been able to get a meeting here in Canada. So it is, I believe, a significant part of this.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Blakey for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Silverman, I just want to return to your comments at the end of my last period of questioning in terms of, I mean, I do think that one of the possibilities here is that governments the world over showing that they're prepared to take more aggressive action in order to be able to try and ramp up vaccine manufacturing might help. And I recognize there are already efforts within the pharmaceutical industry, but it might help incent more rapid collaboration and a wider extent of cooperation, and might also, also play into some of the conversations that are rumored to be happening at the board tables of some of these companies. There's been reports that they're already talking about when they could raise the prices of the COVID-19 vaccine. There's been talk about differential pricing, selling vaccine at different costs to different countries, depending on who they're negotiating with. So, I mean, I wonder if you just want to speak to the question of, galvanizing governments at the WTO to show that other options are possible, and as a way of getting leverage with existing manufacturers to accelerate their attempts to expand within the voluntary licensing system and to keep their prices low.
Yeah, I think that's exactly. In my opening remarks, I referenced the role of the TRIPS waiver campaign in helping create some of that momentum and increasing pressure. I also think a policy of non-retaliation around use or invocation of existing TRIPS flexibilities would be very helpful in this space, because it would allow countries the space to drive their own negotiations with pharmaceutical companies within existing legal boundaries and our existing IP framework. And I think that's a way of driving this forward that addresses some of the concerns of industry about unpredictability and the idea of changing the rules of the game midway. These are the rules of the game. So it's not changing them. It's using the rules as they're written. The one thing I would just respond to in your specific comments is around tiered pricing. So I think we do need to be on the lookout for changes to pricing that pharmaceutical companies may want to put in place later on after they perceive that public pressure around the immediate pandemic has receded. However, tiered pricing is not always a bad thing, and it's often quite a useful way of getting access to low and middle income countries and getting universal access at prices that are affordable to different countries, understanding that different countries have different capacity to pay for medicines, even if they're respecting IP, even if they want to contribute to the overall innovation ecosystem. So I don't think tiered pricing is necessarily bad, so long as the prices are affordable in every setting that they are offered in.
Thank you, Ms. Silverman. I'm sorry, Mr. Blakey, your time is up. On to Mr. Hoback for 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for being here this afternoon on a Friday. I am amazed how quickly we actually did get a vaccine developed and actually established around the world. I think it's phenomenal, and it shows you what the private sector can do when given the appropriate incentives to do that. Now, if we went down the path where we brought in TRIPS, would that same motivation be there for these companies to actually do that for the next phase or a variant phase or something else down the road? what kind of dangerous precedents would that set? And I'll go to you, probably Ms. Froelich, to answer that question.
Yes, thank you very much. And we've made comments about that. And my colleague, Mr. Hamill, mentioned that, as you would know, and most of your committee members would know, any business needs as much predictability as possible. If the lay of the land is changing on the spur of the moment, there is no incentive to invest or to continue along that path. It would have a very chilling effect on the industry, especially as we keep saying that things are working well as they are right now. So this would be viewed as, frankly, a punitive or a difficult, very disruptive act on behalf of government. Declan,
okay, but having said that,
yeah, sorry.
Actually, maybe I'll just stop you right there,
yeah.
Because having said that, and I tend to agree with you, it doesn't mean we can't help those countries. It doesn't mean we can't be compassionate. And you talked about some ideas in regards to training, making sure we've got capacity in the actual manufacturing process that we can actually provide to these other countries so that they would have in the future the ability to take on projects like COVID vaccinations and say, yeah, we can do that. And we can put forward a combination of things. We could donate vaccines. We could donate the expertise to do that. Wouldn't that be a way to actually accomplish the end goal of making sure these folks are vaccinated and still keep the industry at the top leading edge to make sure we've got the latest and greatest vaccines coming to the market at all times?
Thank you. The industry has been open and, in fact, suggesting these sorts of solutions from day one when this pandemic started, from it being, as I said earlier, a founding member of the Accelerating Access to COVID Tools. COVAX facility is part of that. It's very clear that they are negotiating, and it is a business. There are different differential prices, as previous witness has just mentioned, making sure that those prices are affordable for those countries that do not have the resources that some developed countries do. So there are a number of initiatives that industry has been very open to. There is no lack of understanding that this is a global pandemic and we need solutions. I can't speak to the individual arrangements for every company that gets into commercial sensitivities, but we do know that some companies are offering at cost. They are not making a profit at this at all. There's a differing range, different models of approach to making sure that companies are able to be viable and continue the work they do, but also make sure that every citizen of the globe is receiving its vaccination.
So, Mr. Evanet, just looking at your position in the UK or in the EU, what are the things that you're looking at in regards to being the most effective and fastest way to vaccinate people in third world countries?
So I think the one thing we have to do is we must keep these supply chains open with of vaccine ingredients, vaccine production, vaccine distribution. Anything which impedes this is going to be a major source of problems. It is the nature of vaccine production that it's typically concentrated geographically. We have a lot of concentration here in Europe and also in places like India. And it's imperative that we persuade governments here not to engage in export controls and not to fragment the single market, which could possibly happen under the existing EU treaties if different countries like Belgium, for example, decided to ban exports. So I think the trade policy side of this is extremely important if we are serious about ensuring distribution, and very important for the commercial case for producing vaccines, because in most countries, other than the biggest, then one needs to be able to export to be able to make a business case for building such a plant and making such a risky investment.
Okay, so is there a strategy, maybe more of a global strategy, that would be better than TRIPS in regards to meeting those ends? So if it means adding capacity in some of these countries, third world countries, why wouldn't we go down that path and making sure that capacity is there, not just for COVID, but for anything else that may come along in the future? And why didn't we learn from AIDS, for example, that we needed that type of capacity in third world countries?
I think that's a very good question. I would also put on the table the H1N1 pandemic, which ended much faster than expected. And as colleagues have said, there were a lot of vaccine manufacturers who actually felt burned because that pandemic ended earlier and they had put in massive investments and were unable to reap particular revenue streams. And so what I think we really need here is for the public sector and the private sector to understand the risks associated with vaccine investments and to structure public procurement contracts and incentives, financial incentives to build capacity in a way that ensures that the world has a lot of vaccine capacity. But remember, having vaccine capacity and then being able to repurpose it to whatever new pandemic comes up are two very different matters. So one needs to have the base, but one also needs to be able to repurpose it, and that takes time. But still, having the base would be a lot better than not having it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Evanet. Sorry, Mr. Hoback, your time is up. On to Mr. Sarai for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank all the witnesses. Very impressive background and knowledge that we've got on this committee from hearing from you. What I've come to conclude or understand from a lot of you is that, and I want to commend the industries who created vaccines in such a short period of time, an accelerated period of time, in the current models that we have, which show that if you invest in research and development and the world puts its minds together, you can come up with solutions very, very quickly. Now, having said that, I think, Mr. Evanet, I heard from you saying that you want to ensure that trade rules are solidified so that vaccines get to the right people at the right appropriate times. However, vaccine production is concentrated. That model used to work. That seems to be the previous case. That's how we relied on. That's what the whole world expected. That's what Canada did. It invested in them. It contracted with agencies. It tried to do some of the better countries that had good trade relationships. But when you, as someone said earlier, desperate times come from desperate measures, countries don't exactly abide by those rules when things get rough and when their own population starts saying, well, me first, and then take care of my backyard afterwards. What's your thought process to that? How do we, doesn't that call for more domestic production, even if it's not concentrated, even if perhaps going forward it might not be economically as wise, but the government may have to put some efforts, as we have done in Canada and Saskatchewan and Quebec, to ramp up production for future? Do you not see that countries will be having more domestic production facilities so that this predicament doesn't happen again?
I would make two observations. Just first, I would note the caution the Korean experience. Korea was exactly at this point 10 to 15 years ago and drew exactly the same lessons that you have from this and built and spent a huge amount of money on a vaccine industry which has not delivered this time around. So having the vaccine capacity there is a most necessary condition for success. This alternative I would put to you is much smarter sourcing. So it has been said by one CEO of a pharma company that the reason that they wanted to source from Switzerland is because Switzerland only has 7 million people and the production capacity was into the tens of millions of doses. So even if the Swiss government needed vaccines for every single Swiss person, there would still be a huge amount which would be left.
But Mr. Evanet, you wouldn't know if Switzerland's going to come up with the vaccine in a time like this in a pandemic. You have to kind of go with, you have to hedge with several industries, several countries.
I agree, one needs to hedge. But please remember that there is a difference between vaccine development and contract manufacturing of vaccines. Correct. And the Swiss have, for example, contract manufacturers who are particularly good. So I think that a combination of smarter sourcing and diversified sourcing, where I'd fully agree with you, is an alternative to spending a lot of money on building up a production capacity, which might not be well directed.
So I will say into that, I agree that sourcing is imperative, and Canada's tried to source it from countries we felt were much better at it. And for research, you have to throw it out to everyone and pick out of that lot that you think is the most promising to get that. But what I'm saying is it positive to have production abilities like the Serum Institute in India, which doesn't necessarily have to develop its own vaccine, but once it can have licensed facilities, which we've heard has been very effective to have those type of facilities here. I think getting the licensing has not been as big of a challenge, but the lack of that facility has been. And for Canada, it might be important to have that going forward, that regardless of who creates it, we would be able to have domestic production, not only to help ourselves, but to help others.
I think there's some merit in what you're saying about the contract manufacturing side of this.
And Mr. Yadav, maybe I can go to you. You see it from a global perspective. Would that be something that Canada should put some resources in so that we are not caught off guard? I think the licensing has been not the issue, but production has been the issue. And then something that we notice being on trade committees, some of our members here and other Canada-US committees and others, the challenge that always happens is yes, it looks great on paper, but when times get tough, even when your stuff is getting loaded on an airplane in China, somebody pays a bigger buck and it gets switched off one cargo plane to another. But if we have our own domestic capacity, we can probably protect ourselves from this event in the future.
Yeah, so I'd like to add two comments. One is Professor Evanet mentioned about the example of South Korea. So while I largely agree that South Korea hasn't been able to vaccinate as many people as some other countries have been, but SK Biosciences in South Korea is indeed a manufacturer of AstraZeneca's vaccine and will be a manufacturer of Novavax's vaccine when that is approved. So the investments that South Korea has made have yielded some benefits. We cannot completely write them off. That's the first point. The second is that given what we've seen around trade and export controls, if we assume a state of the future that we will not let this happen again and we have a global treaty that prevents this from happening, then perhaps we don't need to think about every country looking at domestic manufacturing. If we assume that future scenario will still have similar kinds of export controls, then the important consideration becomes if Canada or any country thinks about having a domestic manufacturing site, contract manufacturing type, then how does that case remain sustainable so that that manufacturing plant is not only serving the needs during a pandemic, but has a steady demand to supply something that is required during routine times? And like Professor Evanet said, it is flexible and can switch from one vaccine platform to another or one vaccine type to another so that its overall demand remains sustainable. And those would be areas to examine when you think about domestic manufacturing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Sarai. By the way, happy birthday, Mr. Sarai. Now we're on to Ms. Gray for 5 minutes, please.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would like to ask some questions of Professor Evanet. My first question is, would you be able to talk about the importance of vaccine producers being able to work with manufacturers globally to ensure the vaccines being produced are up to standard and effective, and specifically, where there could potentially be risks that might arise with quality control if vaccines are produced under the TRIPS waiver?
So one of the things, a consistent message that you hear from the manufacturers of vaccines and the developers of vaccines is the need to find manufacturing facilities which meet best practices, including the highest standards of safety and regulatory compliance. And so this is something which would have to be taken very seriously. If there were a TRIPS waiver and a free-for-all for production, then I suspect there would be concerns about this. But again, this would be presumably the production would be in the countries offering the waiver, so the risks would be taken by the population in the countries offering the waiver, and that may be a very unsatisfactory situation from a health point of view.
Thank you. Now, you had written about the unclear standards in the EU measures, and Canada is not specifically on the EU's exemption list alongside roughly 100 other countries. We were told it wasn't a concern because countries like Japan and Australia were also not exempted. But since then, Japan has stated that the EU restrictions are already affecting their vaccine supply schedule, and Australia had a vaccine shipment blocked to them as well. So would you consider this a concern or something that would be a big deal for Canada to be worried about?
Yes, I would consider it a concern. We are seeing more evidence within Europe of what's called a chilling effect, and that is that some vaccine manufacturers are not even asking for permission to export because they suspect the the national authorities and then the European Commission will deny it. And there's no guarantee that Canada's interests are protected under those circumstances.
Well, thank you. That leads into my next question. Another concern that you've highlighted in a paper that you wrote on EU export controls is on the authorization decisions. And even if vaccine shipments are authorized, in the end, these measures may add delays between the shipment being prepared and then landing in the intended country. So what type of delays could Canada see in receiving vaccines versus one which is specifically exempted from these types of measures?
So as I'm sure you know, a company which wants to seek an authorization from the European authorities must provide the information to the authorities. Then the authorities check it. Then Brussels checks the national authorities. Both of those authorities can ask for more information. All of this delays potential exportation. And so, again, how this plays out will depend very much on a member state by member state basis. And it must be a source of concern, which is why I wrote that up back in earlier in the year.
So are you saying, just to be clear, that we wouldn't even know if a vaccine shipment was rejected? It's not something that would really be publicized or that we would even know about. It would just happen, and we wouldn't know the rationale behind it?
That's one point. And the second point is we wouldn't even know cases where a vaccine manufacturer in Europe didn't ask for authorization because they anticipated denial of an application. So that we wouldn't even know either. And so that's exactly why this system that the European Union has at the moment is non-transparent.
So would part of that concern as well be because we don't know what the content of the different contracts are, so we wouldn't know what would be expected, and what the different authorizations and what the different contracts would be to fulfill, because there hasn't been any transparency here. So what you're saying is, because we haven't had any transparency with the contracts, we wouldn't know what has been approved of, and we wouldn't even know where what issues there are, because there hasn't been any transparency all along the way. Is that a fair assessment?
There is plenty of non-transparency both in the contracting process and in the export authorization process. But I would say in preparing for today's session, I did look on the Government of Canada's websites, and there are clear schedules for delivery. And I'm assuming that those schedules of delivery were informed by the contracts that Canada had signed. And so one could essentially match up those forecasted delivery dates with what Canada actually receives and then identify whether or not there is in fact a delay.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gray. On to Mr. Raya for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I'm really concerned when the representatives of the global industry start facilitating partisan political attacks. Complaining about not getting a meeting is more on style rather than substance. And Mr. Lipkus, I have got a question for you. You mentioned the TRIPS Article 8, Article 31, Article 6, and you also mentioned the amendments made in 2003, that there are flexibilities available. And if I understand you rightly, there is no need for any knee-jerk reaction to battle the current pandemic by going in for changing the TRIPS. Am I correct?
So the way I see it is there are the current flexibilities on one end of the spectrum, and then a waiver is basically saying let's completely do away with copyright, patents, industrial designs, and trade secrets, which is a very big carve out from TRIPS. If the existing flexibilities may work, if potential manufacturers who meet all of these capacity requirements are able to comply with those flexibilities. If they are able to identify the need, understand exactly what they are going to need to be able to make sure they take all the steps needed to ensure that those vaccines are properly identified and not re-exported anywhere else. If they meet the TRIPS requirements and they're able to do it, then the TRIPS flexibility is enough. If on the other hand,
thank you, Mr. Lipkas. Madam Chair, I would like to give my remaining time to my colleague Rachel Bendayan.
Thank you, colleague, and Madam Chair, with your permission, I would like to ask Mr. Everett a few questions following his discussion with Ms. Gray, because it is an issue near and dear to me and one that I'm working on quite carefully with the Minister of International Trade. And so, Mr. Everett, as you yourself pointed out, there is a schedule online for all Canadians to see as to when our expected deliveries are to arrive. I see that you're nodding in agreement. I think that that is an important point to be made, because we do know whether or not a shipment comes in based on that schedule, of course, and the history of these last few months since the export controls were introduced shows us that not a single one of our shipments was refused or delayed for export authorization purposes. I understand, of course, your concern, but do you agree that we would know if a contractor or manufacturer was not even asking for an export authorization because we have the dates in front of us?
I mean, presumably the government of Canada must know what it contracted for and what lands in Canadian airports.
We certainly do.
So I think that's pretty clear. The chilling effect argument that I made earlier is one that we have seen within Europe. It may not yet have applied to exports to Canada, but then your colleague was asking me about risks, not necessarily about definitive outcomes.
Correct, and we have been successful in ensuring that all Canadian shipments did receive export authorizations, and we have numerous assurances from the European Union that would continue to be the case. We have seen only one export authorization refused, and that was to Australia, and that was for AstraZeneca, which is really the target of these export restrictions when you parse things out and really look into the details. Would you agree with that?
As a statement of fact, you're correct.
Thank you, Mr. Everett. Madam Chair, do I still have time? I have. Madam Chair?
Just under a minute, please.
Thank you. In which case, I would like to go back to an earlier discussion. I believe it was involving Mrs. Fallick with respect to our investments in research and development and the life sciences sector. I believe you mentioned over the last many decades. I understand, I have a few statistics here, that we cut research and development investments at the federal level quite significantly between 2017 and 2014, and even earlier than that, in comparison to other OECD countries. Do you think that the cuts to research and development and to life sciences in Canada made during those early years, thinking primarily, of course, of 2007 to 2011, which I believe has the highest number of cuts, did that impact the industry and our ability to grow the industry?
The simple answer is yes, and certainly it is a signal among many that shows the life sciences sector writ large has not been embraced as a strong industry with potential to help Canada's economy and health.
Thank you, Ms. Fralick. I'm sorry, Ms. Bendayan.
Thank you.
I'll try and see if there's still time at the end. On to Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. According to an article from Reuters from November 13, 2020, Canada's reliance on supply contracts to secure COVID-19's vaccines from drug makers like Pfizer has put daily life for Canadians and prospects for the economy over the next year in the hands of a few foreign companies facing overwhelming global demand. The The article adds that as other governments pour hundreds of millions or billions into vaccine development, Canada has earmarked $1 billion to buy vaccine doses abroad. To what extent is this article accurate? Anyone may answer this question.
Who would like to answer the question from Mr. Savard-Tremblay?
I will jump in, and perhaps my colleague would like to, or Professor Evanet. But I don't have the global comparison, but we certainly are, and I've been stating this all along, that the investments and the support of life sciences sector and the innovative medicines industry has not been strong in Canada. I would like to add, because I haven't had a chance to do so, that what we have seen in the last few months, the outreach from the current government to this industry, has been remarkable. And to me, it's such a good news story for Canada of what can be. I can't help but think of what we might have left on the table previous years and what might be ahead of us. So there is an optimism for me that the government will start embracing this industry and appreciate not just that it's a cost center in their eyes, but a value center as well. And so we'll look forward to what the government will do going forward.
I would just add that Canada obviously is a federation, and a successful life sciences strategy and policy involves the provincial governments, notably Quebec and Ontario, and the governments of Ontario and Quebec, Premier Legault's government and Premier Ford, I think, are actually already kind of there. They understand the importance of the life sciences, and they're willing to get on board and do things differently in the future.
Thank you very much. Sorry, your time is up, Mr. Savard-Tremblay. On to Mr. Blakey for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. So we've heard a number of our witnesses today talk about the importance of certainty for investment in the pharmaceutical industry, and I think it's beyond dispute that the pharmaceutical industry has done a very good job of creating an intellectual property regime globally that provides a lot of certainty and price protection for their industry. But I mean, I find it hard to believe that a waiver, a targeted and temporary TRIPS waiver in respect of a COVID-19 vaccine could really jeopardize that larger context of certainty. Certainly, it couldn't have interrupted any medium or long-term investment that the industry was engaged in prior to the pandemic, because nobody really saw this coming. So I mean, we are in uncertain times. Everybody is living through uncertainty. There have been massive risk mitigating investments by the public sector in respect of most of the vaccines that are out there. And we'll just say, for the sake of the record, I think it's perfectly appropriate to provide some relief from the usual regime for the purpose of expanding global supply, even if this is only one component of what needs to be done in order to realize that expansion. But when it comes to the kind of statement that can be made at the World Trade Organization by implementing the waiver, I mean, one of the things we heard from Ms. Silverman is that there are still bilateral and multilateral trade agreements that could provide barriers to some countries in benefiting from a TRIPS waiver. But is it not also the case, Ms. Silverman, that having an understanding at the WTO might help countries that are seeking further exemptions under bilateral or multilateral trade agreements get those exemptions if we start at the WTO and then work our way down through those agreements, rather than trying to have countries fight on all fronts without any kind of international consensus or decision that they can point to?
Thank you for the question. So I think it's a bit complicated. On the one hand, I think you're right. So if this measure was adopted at the WTO, it would certainly be a signal of support from the underlying member states of the WTO, who are the ones engaged in the bilateral and multilateral trade deals that would otherwise apply. So their support would certainly be a signal that they are looking to be more flexible. Now, that signal can be sent in other ways, of course. This is only one of many ways. So I agree it would be a signal. I think the thing that's complicated here is that, again, it is my view that the waiver itself does not have much practical value but that a campaign around the waiver and the threat of the waiver and the threat of compulsory licensing can motivate good behavior. In a way, if you actually adopt the waiver, you're then removing that leverage point to some degree. And you can have pharma companies saying, well, why should we take this effort to do this? You adopted the waiver, you go do it, right? So I think it's a complicated, the dynamics there are complicated, right? Because it's a leverage point because pharma sees it as a very negative precedent and a source of uncertainty, not really related to this particular pandemic, but related to the future of the entire industry.
Thank you, Ms. Silverman. On to Mr. Lobb, please, for 5 minutes.
Thanks. Thank you, Madam Chair. My kids are at home today and they just finished the Royal Rumble, so there's a lot of screaming in the background here, so you'll have to apologize there. I just wanted to point out Ms. Bendayan's comments about looking back in previous years and trying to lay blame. I don't know that that's all that productive. If you go back, you know, a previous government and a previous government, pretty soon we're at John A. Macdonald for blame here. So it's pretty safe to say that the Liberals had 4 or 5 budgets before COVID and spent over $1 trillion, and they could have, you know, if they wanted to do something, they had plenty of time and money to do it. But I appreciate everybody's comments here today. And I think back to my manufacturing years, and to set up a plant, even a basic plant, takes extreme amount of time, takes a lot of expertise, engineers, electricians. And to be able to set up a plant that runs is one thing, runs well without scrap, and in this case, runs well to produce world-class vaccines. So there is a lot to be said here, and I hope that everybody that's involved in politics and governance and the public service has learned a very valuable lesson with our lack of production here and the inability to procure vaccines when we need it. I look at the Australia example, the recent CSL example, where they're producing AstraZeneca in a big way. And I think that's maybe a model that we need to look at, is to have the ability to procure something here and manufacture something here to protect our citizens so that we can then serve the rest of the world in a generous way. I just wondered if anybody wanted to comment on that example in Australia with CSL and what's going on there right now that's positive.
Would like to comment. Mr. Evnet?
Yes, and this is the case that I have read up on. My understanding is that CSL was a candidate for trying to produce a vaccine and was unsuccessful. The production facilities were there. They meet the regulatory standards, which one of your colleagues emphasized as being very important. And the Australian government did indeed tie the procurement contract to a requirement for some degree of local manufacturing. Again, they built some hedging into this. So again, this might be the type of flexible and smart procurement which could be done. But please note the prerequisites. The Australians had the facility in place before they could take the step.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. And that's my preamble there in the beginning, was just how complicated it is just to set up the most basic of production facilities, let alone a world-class vaccination production facility. So thank you. Does anybody else want to comment on that briefly before the time runs out?
I would just say that for the benefit of the committee members, there's a really good article which came out a few months ago by a fellow called Derek Lowe, Myths of Vaccine Manufacturing, which is worth taking a look at in terms of just what goes into manufacturing vaccines. And, you know, it sort of demonstrates, you know, the discussion around TRIPS waivers and IP is a little bit off key in the context of the issues relating to manufacturing. We can provide a copy of that.
All right, thank you very much. I think Mr. Lobb, it's 3 o'clock. Did you want to, you're okay, you've got your answers? Okay.
That's good, Ms. Groh. We go over many times and we'll finish on time.
Okay, you have a minute left if you want to use it.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much to all of the witnesses for the very valuable and interesting information as we deal with a complex and critically important plan that we learn as much as we can from all of our witnesses. So thank you all to all of our witnesses. We appreciate that, especially Mr. Evanet, who came all the way from, who is talking to us all the way from England via the video. So thank you all very much. This is Friday, so have a wonderful weekend, and we'll all see you on Monday. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.